Thank you so much, Shireen, and good day to everybody that's joining us for this fireside discussion. Very much looking forward to it, as we're going to be looking at a very important topic around the issue of ESG, which of course is the data challenge. My name is Ian Cochran, and I am a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Business School, a member of the Centre for Business, Climate Change and Sustainability, as well as the program director of our MSc on Climate Change, Finance and Investment. And today I will be moderating this fireside discussion that will really be diving into this question of ESG data and treating these issues, particularly in the ASEAN region, of availability, accuracy, and how do we begin to access and use the data we need on both the E, the S, and the G. And so over the next 30 minutes, we'll be hearing from three panelists that are joining us for this chat today, where we'll be hearing first a set of remarks around a question that I have prepared for each one of them, and then we'll be following that up with a open discussion within the panelists, closing again in about 30 minutes time. So before I ask this first round of questions, I just want to introduce our panelists very briefly. Firstly, we're joined by Najmuddin Mohd Lutfi, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of BIMB Investment Management, Berhad. We're also joined today by Zakiah Mat Esa, the Head of Sustainability and Strategic Management of SME Bank, Malaysia. And finally, also joined by Dr. Alexis Moyer, who is the Head of ESG and Spatial Finance at the Edinburgh-based Space Intelligence. So I'm going to start with you, Najmuddin. And as a leading investment management company, what role does ESG data play at BIMB Investment to help deliver risk-adjusted returns for investors?
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. We started the ESG journey back in 2015. And so it's been 7 years for us. And we have integrated ESG into our investment process when we construct our Sharia investment portfolios. And this is possible also because of our strategic partnership with Arabest. And I think the ESG framework that Arabest has, the Arabest S-ray, that provide a quantitative measurement of ESG scores and ratings for companies, actually have provided a much more, I guess, transparent and much more clarity on how we are able to integrate non-financial information, which is the ESG information, with the financial information. So it has been our investment approach for all our Sharia investment funds, Sharia investment portfolios since 2015. And from there on, we were able to deliver and offer varieties of Sharia ESG investment asset classes to the Malaysian investors. So ESG has been the integral investment process, for us since 2015.
Great, thank you so much, Najmuddin. I'd now like to turn to Zakiah and learn a little bit more about the experience of SME Bank. So, again, as a leading development finance institution, how is SME Bank using ESG data to support government policy and drive economic growth through the financing of SMEs?
Good afternoon from Malaysia. Thank you, Mr. Ian, for the introduction and for the question. First of all, let me share a brief background of SME Bank Malaysia. SME Bank is one of the developmental financial institutions in Malaysia, fully owned by the Ministry of Finance and supervised by the Ministry of Entrepreneur Development and Cooperatives. Being a GEFI, our mandate is to provide financing and advisory services to SMEs involved in manufacturing, services, and construction sectors. Sustainability-wise, we have developed a 3-year sustainability roadmap last year based on 3 pillars: responsible banking, responsible business practices, and creating social impact. As compared to BIMB just now, as mentioned by Mr. Najmuddin, actually we just started our sustainability last year, and based on our 3-year roadmap, we have 3 phases. Being the first phase is ESG initiation and streamlining business focus, of which happened last year. The second phase, ESG implementation and streamlining non-business focus, i.e. non-financing, is this year, and next year will be ESG adoption and continuous improvements towards sustainability. Talking about ESG data, basically the bank has already started collecting the relevant ESG data in relation to financing activities upon establishment of our sustainability sukuk framework and our issuance of our maiden sustainability sukuk of 500 million last year. Under the framework, we are required to prepare and publish our sustainability sukuk report on our website annually and on a timely basis in case of material developments. In addition to the above, the ESG data that we collected will be reported to the Central Bank, Bank Negara Malaysia, under the performance measurement framework requirement. We also have regular engagement with our key stakeholders, i.e. our shareholder, the Ministry of Finance, as well as our supervising ministry, the Ministry of Entrepreneur Development and Cooperatives, where we share our ESG data and our ESG progress. We believe the ESG data that we provide shall be one of the relevant ingredients to the government in formulating and fine-tuning the relevant policies and guidelines that will contribute towards driving the economic growth of SMEs through the financing programs offered. I believe this shall answer the question of how does SME Bank use ESG data to support government policy and drive economic growth through the financing of SMEs. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Zakiah, and very interesting to hear about this 3-phased approach that you are implementing at the bank, and of course this connection back with how that links with the government support policy around SMEs, and looking forward to learning a little bit more later in discussion. But before we get to that, I'd like now turn to Alexis and learn a little bit about the work from Space Intelligence, and of course from a data perspective, what are the opportunities and challenges relating to the provision of accurate, trusted, and consistent, 3 big asks often in the ESG data space today, information for ESG reporting in the ASEAN region, particularly around climate and nature?
Hi, Ian. Yes, great. Thanks for the good question and the introduction today. So focusing down really on that E of ESG, looking at data for climate, nature, and in addition, I'd like to add biodiversity to that. So in particular, things like looking at water quality, maybe species diversity, the condition of a habitat in a location, the carbon emissions, anything really having to do with the environment and nature is data that needs to be collected, as you say, transparent, reliable data. And this type of data is typically collected on site. So people go out into the field, they take field surveys, they have different equipment. They might be taking environmental DNA, which is relatively new, where you take soil samples or water samples and find trace elements from different species to look at biodiversity. This might be using camera traps to look at different species coming in and out of environment. As you can imagine, it's all quite labor intensive and restricted really to a small scale, a site level really, due to the complexity, the high costs, and the time consuming nature of collecting this sort of environmental data for ESG reporting. Particularly in this region, there are challenging conditions. It's a tropical area. Imagine being in the field all day collecting data. And in addition, it's quite difficult to do ongoing monitoring. So a lot of corporations and financial institutions need quarterly and annual data, up-to-date data for reporting, and doing ongoing in-field monitoring is quite costly and time ineffective. So this is really where the opportunity for satellite data, what Space Intelligence provides, comes into play. So satellite data can be used to scale up some of these measurements across larger areas, for example, entire regions of a country, and even country scale, because Earth observation sensors provide data at quite a large scale and with frequent revisit time. So the satellites are flying over, sometimes on a daily basis, a weekly basis, to provide that information with high frequency. And one of the challenges, again, because it's a tropical region, is that it's harder to acquire cloud-free imagery, especially during the rainy season. But luckily, the frequent passes of the satellite means you're able to get multiple clear images a year for analysis. In addition, there's different types of satellite imagery that can collect environmental data. For example, radar imagery, which uses an active sensor. So that means it emits radiation down towards the Earth, and then it's reflected back. So we can see through clouds to provide data during this data dry period in the rainy season, particularly relating to surface roughness, for example, and vegetation degradation. So again, information that could be used for that E of ESG reporting. So really the opportunity from satellite data is that it's able to provide transparent and unbiased insight on what's happening on the ground associated with various sector activities. So for example, looking at the impact of a mine, for example, or a palm oil plantation on the surrounding environment in terms of deforestation, forest degradation, other changes in the environment, such as flooding and water stress. For example, if a tailings mine burst, for example, a tailings pile, what the impact would that be on the environment, as well as carbon emissions and historical biodiversity loss. So really all of the big environmental stressors and implications of that E of ESG, there really is an opportunity for satellite data to provide an unbiased view of that information.
Great, thank you so much, Alexis. And I think here the key point here is how do you get this transparent and this, this data that we can trust and then use for investment. And again, the satellite solution being a way of, particularly on a lot of the environmental side of things, digging into really what's going on the ground and collecting that data. So thank you for that overview. I'll come back to you in a little bit later with a couple of questions to learn more. But I'd like now to turn back to Najmuddin. And I think we've heard from Alexis a little bit about the environmental, the E side of ESG on the measurable, but it'd be great perhaps to hear from you a little bit about the challenges we might be having today around the S and the G on the social and the governance side, and how do we begin to link these different pieces together for a holistic ESG management approach?
Yes, I think at the end of the day, I think what we're discussing is, how do we have the data, how do we collect the data, and how transparent this data, and how we deposit this data. I think as a fund manager, we like something that's more transparent, that's more objective, that we can quantify, something that is real time, and we can make the assessment quite quickly. As you know, for investment, we need to be looking at the financial and also now with the non-financial. So I think for the S and G, I think the disclosure is very important. In our case, we're investing in companies, across industries. So it's very important that they are able to disclose on the the social aspect of their operations or their activities, as well on the governance. So given the so I just like to draw our experience with Arabesque, and because we think that Arabesque is quite advanced in terms of managing and facilitating on the on ESG data transparency, and also importantly having a non-biased data that's much more objective. And they have developed, initially it was an Arabesque S-ray, which like I mentioned earlier, you have all the companies inside Arabesque S-ray, and there are more than 400 ESG metrics indicators for the E, S, and G. It's all about disclosures from all these companies. And now they have rebrand Arabesque S-ray to ESG Book. Just like Facebook, it's much user-friendly. Actually, it's free to all companies, any companies in the world, to actually go into ESG Book. The key thing here is for ESG Book is companies or institutions or even governments, they will be able to, they will be in the driver's seat on managing their own ESG data. And it's a platform where you as an entity or organization, be able to disclose information of your companies that will cover the E, S, and the G, and you would know your status, where you stand when it comes to your S or G, and you can actually also apply any of the global standards. If you want to know where you stand in terms of GRI, where you stand on TCFD, where are you on track on your net zero commitment? So everything is in this ESG book. I think it's great. I mean, finally we have something that is easier for the issuers or for companies to disclose their information. It could be SMEs, it could be listed companies, it could be government, it could be institutions. And as for the investors, for us, like the asset managers, we'll be able to go to ESG book and look at the disclosure and also their scoring or their rating, and we can customize it, or we can apply specific standards, whether it's GRI or whether it's SSB and so forth. So we do not have to go to many places or to talk to many people to get the information. So I think this is I think to me, at the end of the day, when it comes to the S and the G, the disclosure is very important for the companies. But I think for Malaysia, when it comes to S and G, particularly in the S, I mean the regulators already provide framework that supporting the industries to encourage more social impact investing. For example, the Wakaf framework, where we'll be able to launch a Wakaf funds. It's like an endowment, where then we're able from the investment returns, then we'll be able to channel it directly to the poor, and we'll be able to see the real impact. I mean, those are more of the application when it comes to the the social impact. I guess at least from the financial industry or the capital market. But I think when it comes to disclosure, I think this what we have seen, the ESG book was just launched December last year. I think it will address a lot of this issue on transparency.
Great, thank you, Najmuddin. And I think again that the theme I'm hearing come out from all this is this importance of transparency, and probably of course that also meaning the quality of the data as well. I'd like now to turn to you, Zakiah, and ask this question about what are some of these challenges for sustainability data and collecting that data from SMEs that you've encountered, and I guess here I'd really ask that question of how are you attempting to overcome some of the challenges we see as to ensuring that quality, and making sure as you enter this into your decision-making process, that data is both transparent and trustworthy.
Thank you, Mr. Ian. Okay, basically collecting data from SMEs is very challenging. As I mentioned earlier, the bank, for SME Bank, we have already started collecting the relevant ESG data when we have our when we establish our sustainability sukuk framework and we issue our sukuk. Case in point for SMEs, for SME Bank per se, we having 99% of our customer base is MSME, micro, small and medium enterprise, whom they are mainly unserved and underserved. The asymmetrical data issue is unavoidable. Some of them are still struggling in capturing, recording and reporting the financial data. What more on ESG data, which sounds quite alien to most of them, especially in micro enterprise space. At present, MSMEs are mainly focused on the business survival, of which cash flow is the key, while other non-business matter, which is not for near-term benefits, is neglected. Collecting and reporting ESG data may not be in their priority list, or even may not be in the list at all. So it is quite challenging for us to capture the data from the SMEs. The data of which it must be reliable, and it must be something that we can use in order for us to report it as they are our customers. So again, some of key challenges that we face is actually there is no global baseline on sustainability related disclosures, and so when we collect the data, we have to disclose. In this case, the standard of disclosure estimated is about 600 ESG reporting standards globally. So one, we have to collect the data. The data must be sufficient, reliable, and again, when we want to disclose, it has to be aligned with the standards. And again, the other challenges that we face is the disconnection between ESG reporting and mainstream financial information. Again, if we were to look from the SME space, it's very challenging, and there is lack of subject matter expert in the organization, be it in the bank or be it in the SMEs itself. And there is also lack of real-time information. So when we collect data, we have to ensure that again it's reliable, it's quantifiable, it's something that we can change the data into information and will be benefit to the stakeholders.
Great. Thank you so much, Zakiah. I think that definitely lays out that challenge, particularly in the SME space, where we are often, the companies don't necessarily have the ability to keep staff on, or experts on their staff to be able to respond to these requests and disclosure requirements, and really making sure. I think that's a great point on real time and quantifiable as well. And I think that's a great segue now to the question I wanted to ask Alexis. Perhaps if it is challenging to go company by company to ask for that disclosure, are we able to use some of the satellite-based approaches, these more, macro level data collection to overcome some of these challenges? And how do we begin to then link that back to the type of decisions in long-term investments investors might be making, where they will need these inputs? And I guess kind of that challenge of moving from a satellite big picture down to understanding at the granularity of an individual client or investment.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ian. So as you say, satellite data can be used to provide some of this insight on some more of the challenging things to collect, data to collect, from example, SMEs on sustainability, particularly in regards, again, to the environmental component of that ESG. And in particular for looking at long-term sustainable investment decisions. So, for example, if you're trying to decide, or a financial institution is trying to decide between investing in two separate options, satellite data can be used to look at, for example, what the impact might be on the supply chain. So if you're looking to invest in a large corporation that has a large supply chain, for example, an agricultural corporation that has a lot of different plantations, a lot of different cropland areas globally or in the region, satellite data can be used to look at the environmental impact specifically of those supply chain elements to help you make a more nature positive investment decision. So that could be information in terms of potential carbon emissions from those facilities, from those plantations. That could be, again, looking at things like water stress in the region, as well as deforestation, again, and forest degradation. So what did the landscape look like before, for example, that those crops were planted? What did the landscape look like before the plantation was established? And that information is important in terms of making a sustainable long-term investment decision, because a lot of shareholders, a lot of different stakeholders want to be seeing sustainable investments and decisions going forward. They're really keyed up and turned on to looking at what they want to put their money into these days, and they want to make sure that they're investing in something that is not nature negative. And that's something that satellite data can help with, as long as we have the location information. So one of the key challenges is, for example, supply chain tracing. And you hear that a lot in terms of ESG, in terms of sustainability, is actually tracing a product from start to finish through the supply chain. And that's where one of the main challenges is, because we often don't have that specific location information. A lot of financial institutions and large corporations don't know exactly where their plantations are, for example. So that's kind of one of the key missing links. And that information needs to be provided so we can use the satellites to show specifically on a plot level what is happening. And that information is very hard to come by. But as you say, the great benefit of using satellite data is that independent view. an ability to assess investment decisions, both on large scale, looking at an entire country, for example, or on a small scale as well. Because the resolution options of satellite data, you can look at things, as I say, across the country, or you can look at things down to centimeter level accuracy. So it is really quite a widespread capability here for satellite data.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexis. And I think that's raising that those, definitely pointing to where satellite data can be useful, but of course, understanding that, we also will, it can't be a replacement for other sources of data, particularly that you are needing these locational supply chain tracing information to be able to make those connections between the two. And I think another interesting point you mentioned is, again, thinking about the potential emissions and how satellite data not only helps you track what's happened perhaps in the past, but can give you a little bit of a forward-looking approach. We're now in about the last 4 or 5 minutes of our chat for today. And how I would like to propose that we close things is maybe I'll just go around to each panelist and ask you in about a minute to talk about one of the challenges that we identified kind of in the run-up to today's discussion. So perhaps actually not a challenge, but maybe one of these new forward-looking topics. So with Najmuddin, I wanted to ask you perhaps just briefly to say a few words about how you see today this link between AI-driven research and analyst-driven research in the ASEAN region. And yeah, perhaps if you have any other closing remarks as well, please don't hesitate to add them in.
Yeah, I think, 2 things. One, on the AI versus analyst, obviously, if you look at least in the investment fraternity, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of market events, meaning that it's a lot of data that need to be processed, need to be digest, and that we need to conclude. So huge data. So I think it's very challenging for for individuals to be able to try to, to make an attempt to try to process all this data. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data technology, certainly be very helpful in the investment decision-making process. Secondly, just sort of my last point, I think when it comes to these challenges on the ESG, I think it's getting much easier now because there is an integration with technology. For example, ESG book, for example, it's an example how it'll be able to facilitate any companies, whether you're big or small, to be able to start the journey. So the very least is, you know where you stand. You can start, of course, there are so many questions, depending on the standards and the frameworks, but at least you can go to a very friendly sort of dashboard, to start the journey instead of trying to invest, a lot of money with consultants, for example. Because in the ESG, for example, it has all the main standards or the main framework, and in fact, you'll be able to customize your own standards and frameworks into the ESG book. So, if anything, I think there's not much awareness about how an institution be able to disclose their information, because for them, they understand the ESG concept is very important. There's a lot of communication about it, but I think for them to start, I think this is where there need to be a lot more engagement, because there are tools out there like ESG to be able to make it easier for them to disclose information. And I don't think they should worry about it. And I think for the SMEs, for example, eventually, at least for Malaysia, by next year, the financial institutions need to be able to assess climate-related risk. Yeah. So if you don't have that information, how are you going to get financing? How are you going to get funding? How are you going to get investors? So the SMEs has really no choice. For you to grow and to expand your business, you have to have not just your financial information, but also your non-financial information. So, so they have to start the journey, and I think tools like ESG will be able to assist them, because yes, it's like a black box. But with tools like ESG, it's no longer a black box. I mean, and to be able to make it easier for many to to start the journey. But importantly, is to take that first step and don't delay. That's all I'm saying. Because at the end of the day, if you you are a business, moving forward, you will be judged not just on your financial, which is historical, but it's also on your non-financial information.
Great, thanks so much, Najmuddin. I think that's a very good message, perhaps for some of our listeners to come away with, is that this is, again, something that's moving much more towards, a regulatory requirement in some areas, and that it is something that we need to find functional and effective solutions to make it accessible, particularly to SMEs and other types of clients and corporate actors. Zakiah, now over to you. Perhaps the forward-looking topic that I'd ask you to say a few words on before we close is, how is this actually a way to incentivize sustainability? Not just about reporting, but really helping to ensure that this is a tool to help us achieve, the sustainable development objectives, national goals and plans around climate or biodiversity, as well as, of course, ensuring that we are supporting a just and sustainable transition.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, basically in SME Bank, even though we consider ourselves still at nascent stage, i.e. ESG, we have just formally started last year, but throughout the journey, we already issued our sustainability suku, the first sustainability suku issued by GEFI in Malaysia, and we won few prestigious awards of it. And out of it, we have to innovate, we have to develop product or program that would incentivize the SMEs, because to the SMEs, the bottom line is very important to them. So if we want to get them to join the ESG journey, we have to incentivize them. So we are glad to share that in SME Bank, we have developed and launched 2 financing programs for MSMEs, where the incentive is for those customers that comply to ESG throughout the financing tenure, we are giving them profit rebate. So the intended objective here is the customer, they have to track their ESG journey, they have to ensure that they are on track, and they have to report to us in order for them to enjoy the rebate. The main intended objective here is not only to reward them with the rebate, but more importantly, to inculcate ESG awareness and discipline them throughout the ESG journey. So when we train them, when they are disciplined in capturing the ESG data, they provide to us. That data is useful for us to devise our strategic, and onwards, we will share that data with the ministry as well. So basically, this should not be the last one. We really have to innovate. We really have to find the best way to incentivize the SMEs so that it will be more interesting for them to join the sustainability journey, because they cannot be left behind. Even though, let's say, they are not an exporter, and they don't require that ESG that much, but from the supply chain, whereby if they are supplying to the, let's say, the big organization, the GLCs, they have to be ESG compliant so that they will be able to remain in that supply chain. So, like it or not, they have to start now, and it's not for them to walk, they have to run. That's all.
Great, thank you so much, Zakiah. And I think that idea of running definitely does, of course, reflect as well the need for us collectively to move forward on the sustainability challenge, and of course finding those incentives that really help move everyone forward, SMEs included, is an important factor to take into account beyond the issues of data quality as we've discussed today. So now, Alexis, over to you for a few final words, and perhaps I would ask you to say a few more words on an issue that you raised about, again, this forward-looking aspect. And I know it goes perhaps a bit beyond the challenge of challenges around satellite data, but again, within the sustainability space, we are looking now about not just past but future performance. And maybe if you might be able to say a few words about how you see that in the ESG space, and particularly again how we can start to link that to some of the instruments or the type of analysis we need to conduct on these different issues.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. So looking at the difference between backwards looking data, as you say, and forwards looking data. So backwards looking data being what we would typically provide: baseline information, carbon stock information, things like that, looking at the environmental impact in the past. That's the backward looking data. Looking towards the future, as I already briefly mentioned, space data can be used to help provide insight on investment decisions. So looking at what impact might occur in the future if you convert a plot of land to a plantation, if you convert that to an agroforestry project, for example. And that sort of information can be used to link towards, for example, sustainability linked finance assets like green bonds, where you're investing or taking out a bond in a forest project, for example. So using that forward-looking information to decide where best to create that project, what that might look like in the future. And the last point I wanted to make about ESG data in general is that I think we need to, once the reporting has started, and I know a lot of organizations and corporations are just in taking their first steps in the ESG world. But once that information has been collected and reported, we need to really move beyond that and say, okay, so we have this ESG data. We're not just ticking a box to say this is what our performance is in these categories. We want to know how to improve then. So we need to provide insight, for example, on how to improve biodiversity, how to improve our environmental impact. So for example, if we have done an assessment that shows an area has been deforested and there used to be a really rare plant there, we can use that insight, use that data to go forward and say, okay, let's plant this native vegetation back here where it was and really improve going forward. So it's not just an exercise, it's really, why are we doing this? Why is this data being required to be collected? Because of the dual climate change and biodiversity crises, and how do we move forward as corporations, as individuals, in really taking that forward to improve our well-being just for the environment as well as for local communities.
Great, thank you, Alexis. I think that issue of being able to move from disclosure to action and really link this analysis we're corporate actors or different companies are doing to the steps taken either to make themselves more sustainable or have an impact, and contribution to resolving the sustainability challenges we're all faced with, is a really important part and a great point to finish on for today's fireside discussion. We've run a few minutes over, so I'll be very short in the summary, but at first, virtual round of applause to our three panelists today. Thank you so much, Najmuddin, Zakiah, and Alexis for joining us. And I think as takeaways, I don't think I can summarize a lot of everything we've said, but I think, a few key words have come out for me that speak to the challenge of ESG data in the ASEAN region. And I think really link up to the challenges we're facing globally on this topic, which is really getting that transparency that we need to have, that trust in the data that's both backward and forward looking, thinking about how we build this capacity both internally as financial institutions, but also within clients to collect, to develop the systems needed to report on these type of issues. And then of course, thinking about those incentives and the linking up of this data with the actual operational challenges that really allow us to contribute and overcome the sustainability challenge. And again, in this critical decade for climate, biodiversity, and of course, a socially and economically just transition, really making sure this is not just another reporting requirement, but a real tool to help us collectively solve these challenges. So again, many thanks to my three panelists for their time today. And now I will hand things back over to you, Shireen, as we move forward with today's agenda.